Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The missing body of Henry VIII's executed wife. There is a well-known story passed down through the past 500 years surrounding a king, Henry VIII, and his 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But Henry VIII then went further than just executing 2 of his wives. He completely erased them from history in a sense. But how far was he willing to go? With Anne Boleyn, he erased the memory of her through the destruction of propaganda and art and her belongings. She was executed on charges for treason, incest and adultery. But with Catherine Howard, he tried to literally erase her mortal presence, and her remains are lost to this day. Or are they? Catherine Howard married the king when she was as young as 15 years of age, and Henry was 49. She was strategically placed into the eye line of Henry by her uncle, and by some turn of fate, some may say, she was actually related to Anne Boleyn, Henry's executed second wife. Catherine was her cousin. Catherine had grown up in the care of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Duchess of Norfolk, and Catherine had a rough childhood. She was subjected to loss and was forced to grow up before her time. She lost her mother when she was around 10 years old, and her father sent her to live with her step-grandmother. It was here, in the home of the Duchess of Norfolk, that Catherine's fate was sealed. For within a decade, Catherine would have been groomed by a multitude of men, married to a man who was more than double her age, and severely obese, and had a temper, and then losing her head at the hands of that same man, the king. Catherine Howard was born to an upper-class family between 1518 and 1524, but the exact date is unknown. Her childhood, up until around the age of 10, had not been recorded in the history books, but what we do know is that when she was around 10 or 12, her mother passed away. This meant that Catherine was then moved to live with her step-grandmother. There has been a question debated within the historian circles, and that is the question is that whether Catherine Howard knew what she was doing when she had a sexual relationship with men other than Henry VIII, who later became her husband. But something we do know is that the decisions of Catherine and those around her when it came to intimate relationships are ultimately the ink used to sign the death warrant for the young girl. You see, before Catherine married the king, she had relations with her music teacher, Henry Manox. She was just 13. The relationship with Henry Manox taught her a lot in terms of bedroom antics, and when she married Henry VIII, it is said that he was amazed at her skills. But again, this was not something that should have been celebrated. Now, next, Catherine was introduced to a man called Francis Derham. He was entertained by Catherine and her friends in the house of the Duchess, and Catherine went on to having a sexual relationship with him as well. You see, in the 1500s, gossip was rife, and the virginity of an upper-class girl was considered an important asset that should be protected until marriage. Reputations could be ruined, and a young girl's prospects destroyed. Now Agnes Tilney, the Duchess of Norfolk, she failed in her duty to protect Catherine and the other wards, and Catherine's childhood would come back to haunt her when she married the King of England. Now, she managed to keep her past under wraps for the time being, and Henry showered her with gifts and he indulged her. She was certainly subjected to her marital duty, but with Henry away from court, more often than not, Catherine found comfort in the arms of another man, Thomas Culpeper. Now, it's unknown if the relationship went beyond the realms of just friendship, but this is the relationship that ultimately sealed her fate. Now, it is believed that Henry would have forgiven Catherine for her premarital activities, but the fact that Culpeper confessed and that her dirty laundry, in a sense, was aired for the world to see, made his thoughts of mercy turn to rage. Poor Catherine Howard didn't stand a chance. Love letters were found between Catherine and Thomas, and in one he referred to her as his little sweet fool, and it's believed that the meetings between Catherine and Thomas were made possible with the help of Jane Boleyn, or Lady Rochford if you like. She had arranged secret meetings between the pair, And it's also thought that these meetings went on for months with no one suspecting a thing. It was only when word reached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, of Catherine's situation and her behaviour, that Catherine's world came tumbling down. You see, what's interesting is that Thomas Cranmer never approved of the marriage between Catherine and Henry, not because he didn't like Catherine, but because of her grandfather, Thomas Howard. He was a strong opponent, and Cranmer was informed by a man called John Lascelles that his sister Mary Hall used to work in the house of Catherine when she was just a teenager, and that Catherine had fornicated with Henry Manox, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper. Thomas Cranmer must have seen this as an opportunity to discredit any supporter of Catherine, and with Catherine out of the way, he could then suggest the name of a bride who, like Anne Boleyn, would favour religious reform. Now, during Cranmer's investigation, he spoke with Mary Hall, the woman who worked in Catherine's household as a teenager, and she told him about Catherine's relationship with Manox in 1536. She said that she had gone to see Manox to warn him of his behaviour, and he told her the following: "Hold thy peace, woman, I know her well enough. My designs are of a dishonest kind, and from the liberties the young lady has allowed me, I doubt not of being able to elect my purpose. She hath said to me that I shall have her maidenhead, though it be painful to her, not doubting but I will be good to her hereafter." Mary then claimed that for 100 nights or more Francis Dereham had crept into the lady's dormitory and climbed, dressed in a doublet and hose, into Catherine's bed. Catherine was questioned about Thomas Culpeper. Cranmer told her that he had heard a rumour that they were romantically involved and were about to marry. Catherine replied, "What should you trouble me thereabouts? For you know I will not have you, and if you heard such report, you know more than I." You see, Cranmer was searching for someone who had committed adultery with the Queen, and Thomas Culpeper was to be arrested and questioned. Catherine also confessed about her relationship with Henry Manox. "My sorrow I can by no writing express, nevertheless I trust your most benign nature will have some respect unto my youth, my ignorance, my frailness, my humble confession of my faults, and plain declaration of the same, referring me wholly unto your Grace's pity and mercy. First at the flattering and fair persecutions of Manox, being but a young girl, I suffered him at sundry times to handle and touch the secret parts of my body, which neither became me with honesty to permit, nor him to require." Cranmer thought these confessions would please Henry, but they did not. Henry wanted more time to think about the situation and ordered that Catherine be moved, and that the 3 men sent to the Tower of London to be questioned. Catherine was then held at Sion Abbey for the duration of her imprisonment, whilst Henry stayed at Hampton Court. Henry saw Catherine for the last time the day she was arrested. When Henry Manox was questioned, he admitted he'd been employed by the Duchess Agnes to teach Catherine music and singing, and admitted having tried to seduce her. When the Duchess discovered them kissing, she had beaten them both and commanded that they should never be alone together again. This had not deterred Manox, and on another occasion she had agreed he might caress her private parts. In his words, he had felt more than was convenient. However, he told his interrogators, upon his damnation and most extreme punishment of his body, he never knew her carnally. Then over the next couple of weeks, a trial for Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham took place, and both were subsequently executed at Tyburn. Henry Manox was incredibly lucky to escape this fate. The Privy Council felt that he had committed no crime and released him. Thomas Culpeper was beheaded, but Francis Dereham was hung, drawn and quartered. Then, as customary for the time, both men had their heads placed onto spikes and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to the cities of London that treason, especially against the king, was no laughing matter. It is believed that Catherine was aware of these executions, and the fear she must have felt knowing deep down that she must be next. Now what is sad is that whilst Catherine was imprisoned, a new law was passed, a law that made it treason for a queen consort not to disclose her sexual history to the king within the first 20 days of marriage, as well as to commit adultery against her royal husband. This law was called the Royal Assent by Commission Act of 1541. This act meant there was no need for a trial, and the evidence was stacked against the helpless Catherine Howard, who was then sentenced to death. Henry did not show Catherine the same mercy he did with his second wife, for Anne Boleyn had spent the last few days of her life with a small amount of comfort, but Catherine suffered in ways that even today bring a tear to the eyes of those investigating her life. When the Lords of the Council came for her, she allegedly panicked and screamed as a man handled her into the barge that would escort her to the Tower on Friday the 10th of February 1542. Her flotilla passed under London Bridge, where the heads of Culpeper and Derham were impaled. Once Catherine entered the Tower of London, she entered through Traitor's Gate and was led to her prison cell. The following morning, Catherine would learn that her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday the 13th of February 1542, and that she had just 3 more days to live. Catherine Howard was told to dispose of her soul and prepare for death. She was to die at 9 o'clock the next morning. You see, the night before her execution, Catherine spent hours praying. She's also thought to have practised placing her head onto the block. According to Eustace Chapuis, Catherine requested that the block be brought to her so that she might know how to place herself. Her request was granted, and the block brought into her chamber. On the morning of February the 13th, Catherine woke early and made her way out of the apartment she was imprisoned in and towards the scaffold that had been erected for her execution. It is said that as Catherine approached, she was terrified and pale. She was petrified of what was coming next, so much so that she needed help climbing the stairs. Once on the scaffold, Catherine was so weak that she could hardly speak, but she said that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king, who had so graciously treated her. It is also said that she then asked all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment with death for her offences against God, and heinously from her youth upwards, in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty, very dangerously. There is also a rumour throughout history that states the following. When Catherine was on the scaffold, she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." But, as stated, this is just a rumour and unlikely to be true. Catherine was so weak that she struggled to speak. The fear had overtaken her. The executioner then gave Catherine a blindfold, which she then placed over her eyes. Then, as she had practised the night before, she knelt down and placed her head onto the block. There was a large crowd there to witness her death, and as the executioner raised the extremely sharp axe, they gasped. Then, with one swift blow, the executioner struck Catherine's neck and removed her head from her body. It was at this point the executioner picked up Catherine's head by her hair and removed her blindfold. He held her head up to the crowd and showed her lifeless face and proclaimed, "God save the King." Catherine was then taken by her ladies, after being covered with a black cloak, to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was then laid to rest. A sad fact is, after Catherine Howard's body was placed into the ground, her body wrapped in the black cloak, a large quantity of quicklime, or lye, was poured over her lifeless corpse. There is speculation as to why. It does not appear to be for hygienic odour reasons. Catherine's grave is the only one in the chapel to have had this horrendous substance used, leading to the sad matter that someone wanted nothing of poor Catherine to remain. The day was not over, for Catherine Howard's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, or Lady Rochford, if you like, was next. Jane had confessed to helping facilitate the meetings between Catherine and Thomas Culpeper. Catherine Howard was only around the age of 18 when she was killed. She had risen to Queen of England in such a short time. and after only a year and a half she was executed for treasonous adultery. Her fall from grace is a very sad and disturbing story, for she was just a young girl that had been used and abused whilst in the care of her step-grandmother, and then placed into the employ of Henry VIII, where her life choices led her down a very dangerous path. Catherine had been remembered in history as being the fifth wife to Henry VIII, but she should be remembered for being brave and courageous and facing her demons on the last day of this earth. Now, Henry can't have been a kind man to the young girl. He was known to have a stern mouth, and Catherine must have felt she needed a release to help her cope with the life she'd found herself in. Thomas Culpeper, no matter his involvement with Catherine, was that release for her, and although Catherine's past and present caught up to her, she died at the behest of a man whose public image meant more. He changed the law to end a young girl's life legally so that he could then move on to the next poor soul. Catherine's death, however, wouldn't be the end for her. Her remains would go missing. As stated, after her death, she was buried within the walls of St. Peter ad Vincula, and after being wrapped in a black cloak, a very large quantity of quicklime was poured over her remains. With Catherine being the only person to have this substance used on her, it shows Henry's true intentions. With Anne Boleyn, he removed all objects relating to her, but with Catherine Howard, he literally made sure she could never be found by dissolving her remains in quicklime, and this is shown in a restoration project during the reign of Queen Victoria some 300 years later. It was in the early part of 1876 that a proposal was submitted to try and restore the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula to its original state and turn it into a place of worship for the residents and guests of the tower. Then, in the August of the same year, restoration began, under the strict instruction from Queen Victoria, in relation to the removal of the remains into the crypt, that the greatest care and reverence should be exercised in this removal, and that a careful record should be kept of every sign of possible identification which might come to light. You see, the coffins had been broken up and the bones scattered to make room for a new burial. It was therefore decided that immediate steps should be taken for removing the remains into the crypt. Victoria's wishes were adhered to, and all remains were found and collected and placed into boxes which were labelled with an inscription. Intact coffins were also removed to the crypt. In the October of 1876, attention then turned to the restoration of the chancel, where it was known that Queen Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, the Dukes of Somerset, Northumberland and Monmouth were buried. It was hoped that this area could remain undisturbed, and that the new pavement could just be laid on top, but this was impossible because in two places the pavement had sunk, and it was thought that below was hollow. So it was decided to remove the paving and rectify the sinking, and to aim to have minimal disturbance to the ground. You see, every spadeful was inspected for remains with a sieve, and anything that was found was then reinterred in the same spot. Then on the 9th of November 1876, the pavement above where Anne Boleyn was believed to be buried was lifted, and it was noted that at this depth the bones of a female were found, not lying in the original order, but which had evidently for some reason or other been heaped together into a smaller space. All these bones were examined by Dr. Mowat, who at once pronounced those to be of a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, and of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The account continues by noting that the vertebrae were particularly small, especially the joint next to the skull, and so bore witness to the Queen's little neck. Now, the next statement is important and shocking. No other female bones were found in the area. All present were convinced that these bones that were found were the remains of Queen Anne Boleyn, who, according to Bell, was recorded as being buried in the front of the altar by the side of her brother George. But it's believed that the map in which those on site used to locate the remains and identify them was wrong, and that the remains of Anne Boleyn were not actually her. You see, the features described of the skeletal remains do not actually match the features described from when she was alive. Alison Weir believes that the bones identified belonging to Anne Boleyn might in fact be those belonging to Catherine Howard, who was aged between 16 and 23 years in 1542, and miniatures of whom by Holbein show her with what could be a jutting square jaw. She also states that the remains identified as Lady Rochford, belonging to a woman of 30 to 40 years and of delicate proportions, are in fact the remains of Anne Boleyn. So the question is, where is Catherine Howard? Or, where's Anne Boleyn? Something we can never be sure of, but can only speculate. A sad truth that one, if not both of the wives of Henry VIII who were executed are missing. Thank you for watching and support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.